And that's not to say that dating apps don't work or that no one's using them at all anymore. Certainly, many people are, but many people are also becoming very disillusioned with the apps and frustrated with it. And I think that's leading the return to kind of going back to the old ways of doing things.
Well, we're so happy you're here with us today. We have some really interesting things to talk about. So, we want to talk about a study that you're going to be sharing with us. Your new study looked at 2,000 single adults across the US. What was the most surprising finding that challenged your expectations about modern dating?
Well, there are a lot of interesting things in that data. So, this was a nationally representative survey of singles across the country and balanced for age and gender and geographic region. And it gives us a kind of comprehensive look at what's going on in the modern dating landscape. And we looked at a ton of different topics from cheating to how economic factors are influencing dating to how many people are just kind of taking a break from sex. And one of the things that I thought was particularly surprising about the data was that we found that almost half of US singles said that they were celibate, either voluntarily or involuntarily right now. And you would think that people are having more sex than they are, but the reality on the ground is that a lot of people aren't as sexually active as we think. And for many of them, they are intentionally taking a break from sex. And maybe it's because the dating market has become too toxic for them, or maybe they just want to focus on personal growth and development, or maybe they're prioritizing their career right now. There can be any number of reasons why people are choosing not to have sex at the moment, but there are also many people who are what we call involuntarily celibate. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they identify as incels, but rather it's that they want to have sexual relationships, but for whatever reason are unable to find a partner. So yeah, that was one of the more surprising findings was just sort of the prevalence of people who aren't having sex these days.
Right. Oh my gosh. That's really surprising because you think, oh, single people, they're out there living it up, having sex all the time. But I guess not.
Right. And we hear a lot in the media about this thing called the sex recession, right? Which is the idea that people today are having less sex than previous generations. And there definitely is truth to that. And this is true for single people, for married people, people of all ages. But for young adults in particular, young singles, that's where we're seeing the biggest drop in sexual activity.
So interesting. So, did you find anything out about how Americans are approaching love and relationships differently today compared to how they did like a decade ago?
Well, so one of the things that we asked about was how is the current economic climate influencing or affecting your dating life? And we found that it was a pretty significant contributor for a lot of people, but again, especially for young adults who are a generation that is struggling financially compared to older adults. And so we found that for many of them, they're approaching dating in different ways. So, for example, that means sometimes going on fewer dates, but it also means pursuing dating activities that are more affordable than, maybe they would have done in the past. So they're going on dates in different ways, and oftentimes they're splitting the bill as well, right? So we're seeing some changing and shifting norms around the expectations regarding who is supposed to pay, for example, when you go on a date. But yeah, economic factors are a big contributor. Also, if you look at LGBTQ folks in particular, we see that the current political climate is affecting dating for many of them. And we actually found that about 1 in 10 LGBTQ people that we surveyed said that they had actually moved to a more LGBTQ friendly area in recent years precisely because of this reason. So, economic factors, political factors are big influences in the modern dating sphere. And I think even more so than they were in the past.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that totally makes sense. So, what about generational differences? Did your research uncover any generational differences in how people define intimacy or commitment?
Well, so we do find generational differences in lots and lots of variables. Young adults are thinking about sex and relationships differently than people at midlife compared to older adults. And, they also have some somewhat different definitions of things like infidelity, for example. And if you think about this technological world that young people today are growing up in and how that was different compared to generations past, it makes sense that there are going to be differences in terms of how people are thinking about their relationships and what their boundaries are in terms of what is appropriate or acceptable behavior. And so young people are more likely to see things like chatting or flirting with an AI bot as a form of infidelity compared to older adults. So, technology I think is very much influencing how young people are thinking about and approaching their relationships. Now, another interesting thing generationally is that if you look at the prevalence of dating app use, so we asked participants what is their primary or preferred approach to dating? And we've read a lot in the media in recent years about how Gen Z is kind of like pulling the plug on dating apps and, approaching it in different ways. And what we see is that the vast majority of Gen Z folks prefer to meet in person organically, right? As opposed to meeting through online dating apps. And so I think there is some truth to this idea that people are kind of going back to some of the old-fashioned ways in terms of how they're meeting and interacting with their partners and letting connections form organically as opposed to connecting with somebody else online. And that's not to say that dating apps don't work or that no one's using them at all anymore. Certainly, many people are, but many people are also becoming very disillusioned with the apps and frustrated with it. And I think that's leading the return to kind of going back to the old ways of doing things.
Yeah, that is so interesting because I think you could make the assumption that, younger generations use more technology. And so, yeah, they would be using dating apps and things like that more. So that is such an interesting finding. So, what did you learn about sexual behaviors in the current cultural landscape? Like, are we seeing shifts in how people explore or express sexuality?
Yes. So something I've seen in a lot of the data that I've collected is that there's been a rise in kink and BDSM related behaviors in recent years, but again, particularly among young adults. So young adults are having less sex overall, but the sex that they are having is kinkier. And so we're seeing a rise in rough sex activities, including things like choking and slapping and spanking and so forth. And I was also reading some new research that had just come out today that looked at the extent to which people of different generations rate rough behaviors as being extreme or not. And what we see is that young adults consider these rough behaviors to be less extreme compared to older adults. So there seems to be this kind of normalization of a lot of kink and rough sex behaviors that's occurring among young adults that might help to explain why we're seeing a rise and increase in these behaviors, particularly in that demographic or population. And in terms of, why is rough sex on the rise? People always like to immediately go to porn and say, oh, this is all porn's fault. And, I think porn does play some role because if you look at mainstream pornography in recent years, there has been an increase in kink and rough related depictions. And porn is becoming the default form of sex education for a lot of young people because they're not getting it in school. No one else is teaching them about it. So where else are they going to go to learn but to porn? And so there could be some role that porn is playing, but we also need to keep in mind that there's been a broader mainstreaming of kink in the media in the last decade or so. Ever since 50 Shades of Grey came out, kink is kind of everywhere in the media. It's present in the songs that we listen to. It's present in advertising and film and television and the books we read. Kink is all over the place. And so I think that is also part of the reason why we're seeing an increase in kink related behaviors, particularly among young adults, because they're just growing up in a time when kink has been kind of more mainstream than ever before.
Did you know a lot of people watch our YouTube videos and never subscribe to our channel? Before you finish this video, take a moment to click subscribe. Yeah, and I'm curious too. I wonder if younger people have more confidence and maybe aren't afraid to ask for something they want or just willing to try more new things.
It could be, but I have a novel theory that part of the reason why young adults are really into kink more than older generations is because kink changes your headspace. So something else we see in the data is that young adults have much higher rates of anxiety compared to older adults. Gen Z is the most anxious generation. And kink is actually very effective in terms of getting out of your head and into the moment. And so I think activities that kind of create more presence and again, take you out of your head, change your headspace, might be particularly appealing to a generation of folks that really does seem to struggle with anxiety. I've said many times before on my podcast and in the trainings and teachings that I do that can be very therapeutic in a lot of ways, in the sense of, helping people to be more present and in the moment.
Yeah. I love that explanation. All right. So I want to know for the therapists, educators, counselors, anyone working with clients, what are some key takeaways from your research that can help us better support people navigating dating and relationships today?
Well, so one big takeaway would be we asked people on this survey how they define infidelity, what counts as cheating. And we gave people a very extensive checklist of behaviors that included everything from having sex with somebody else, kissing somebody else, to sharing secrets with another person, spending money on another person, following somebody attractive on social media, chatting with an AI sex bot. Like we tried to cover everything. And what we found was that there was not 100% agreement on anything. There wasn't one thing that everybody was like, yes, that's absolutely cheating. So that tells us that people have very different ideas about what represents infidelity in relationships. And if you look at something like sharing secrets, we found that about a third of our participants said that if my partner were to share secrets with somebody else, that would represent infidelity to me, right? And so even though the majority of people didn't endorse that idea, you still have a significant number who think that, just forming some type of emotional bond or intimacy with someone else, such as by sharing a secret, crosses a line for them. And I think when it comes to something like infidelity, most people in relationships, whether it's monogamous or non-monogamous, most people don't really clearly define what all of their boundaries are. And as a result, cheating sometimes happens because it was just assumed that something would be okay because there hadn't been a clear boundary expressed around that. And, I do think people in sexually open relationships do tend to talk a little bit more about what their boundaries are, but we can't always predict all of our boundaries in advance, right? Sometimes we don't know it's a boundary until it's been exceeded. And, also we don't always know what it is that's our partners are thinking about when it comes to these types of things. And so I think rather than assuming that our partner is on the same page with us about what is and is not okay behavior in the relationship, we really need to have more clear-cut discussions around it and to define the parameters of, what am I comfortable with and what is acceptable behavior in the relationship. And also what is okay when it comes to technology use in the relationship. We find that about 1 in 5 of our participants say that watching porn is a form of cheating. And,
Mm.
I think a lot of people could benefit from having discussions around pornography use and what healthy pornography use means in relationships. But yeah, it's one of these things where people are all over the place in terms of how they define infidelity. And I think that sets us up for a lot of challenges and conflict and turmoil in our relationships because we're not really discussing that in advance.
Yeah. Oh, I definitely agree. I think, as sexual health professionals, we need to help people come up with creative ways to start these conversations with their partner or partners, and just get it going, get these things out on the table so we can have that discussion to begin with.
Yeah, it would save us a lot of heartache if we talked about these things in advance. And it could also help us to identify whether we're even a good match for somebody in the first place, because sometimes people just have really different values around sex. And it's not to say that one person's values are more correct or right than another. It's about knowing what your own values and boundaries are, communicating and expressing those to your partner and seeing whether or not you're compatible. So it's just really another test of kind of figuring out whether this is a relationship that's likely to work and are we setting it up in a way that's going to minimize the chances of having a lot of future conflict.
Oh, absolutely. So one of the really cool things you do with Sexual Health Alliance is our study abroad programs. So speaking of studying abroad, is there any differences that you've seen across cultures and like anything that's been surprising? Did your study examine any cross-cultural differences?
So, in the research that we didn't get into cross-cultural stuff because we were focused specifically on a US based
Yeah.
sample. But I have conducted other cross-cultural research. For example, are there cross-cultural differences in people's sexual fantasies? And I find that there are. So, one example would be that I find that Europeans tend to be kinky. here in their fantasies on average compared to people in other parts of the world, right? Now, the most common fantasy themes, things like multi-partner sex, kink, trying new and different things, those tend to be pretty common everywhere around the world, but there are some differences in terms of the prevalence of a given fantasy within a given culture. And also the fantasies that tend to be pretty rare or uncommon in one culture, tend to be pretty rare or uncommon elsewhere. So, there's a lot of commonality, but there are also some differences. And another area where we see differences is in who we're fantasizing about, right? So the physical features of the partners that we find to be desirable or attractive vary around the world. And so that's one way that our fantasies differ. It's not always so much in terms of the specific acts that we're doing, but in terms of the types of people that we might find to be attractive and that we're engaging in those activities with. But I love teaching our study abroad courses because we learn all about ways that sex differs around the world. And, we learn, for example, about how laws around sex work differ in different cultures and different legal frameworks that exist, and what are the potential positives and negatives about some of these different legal approaches to something like sex work. We also learn interesting random fun facts. Like, for example, in Iceland, there's actually an app that people will use, and this gets back to dating, they'll use to check to see whether they're related to someone before they go on a date with them, right? Because
I love it.
Iceland is such a small country that
Yeah.
there's actually a much greater chance that you might inadvertently hook up with somebody who you might be related to, right? So it's kind of like an incest avoidance app, right? Where you can check to see what's your level of relation to this person before you decide if you're going to proceed to have any kind of hookup or relationship with them.
That is so fun. Yeah, so many fun things about study abroad. I mean, we could do a whole interview just about all the interesting things that our study abroad programs do. So if you're watching this, check it out on our website at sexualhealthalliance.com. We have a tab about study abroad, and you'll see all of the upcoming places we're going to go into 2026. I know this past year in 2025, we went 4 different places. So next year is going to be amazing as well.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Well, if you love learning from experts like Dr. Justin Lehmiller, check out our upcoming events on our website at sexualhealthalliance.com. There's an upcoming events tab at the top. You won't miss it. Thanks so much for being with us today, Justin.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching our video with Dr. Justin Lehmiller. Do us a favor, share this with someone who might benefit from this information. Your support helps us reach more people with important sexual health information. If you're passionate about this space, we know you'll enjoy these videos, so check them out. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And remember, you are exceptional.